All right, hey everybody, Miss Lynch here, and this is chapter 14, part 2. Okay, alrighty. So the last thing we were talking about, let's see, we had talked about the enlistment of African American soldiers into the Union Army. Okay, okay, let me just. Okay, so yeah, this last bullet point, sorry, I had to think about it for just a second. All right, yeah, this last bullet point. So African American soldiers played a crucial role not only in winning the Civil War, but also in defining the war's consequences, which meant that if the Confederacy won, think about what that would mean for the institution of slavery, right? So that's where I will pick up from this point, okay? So this gives the hate to say it gives the tone of the war a more serious connotation, but in this way, it does make it even more vital um, for Union forces, right, to be successful. Okay, so the slide I'm starting off with is the Second American Revolution, which, yeah, this is sometimes called that. You know, the War of 1812 was also called that. So this could kind of be called the Third American Revolution, I guess. Anyway, whatever. Anywho, so the Second American Revolution. Okay, so to Lincoln, the American nation embodied a set of universal ideas centered on democracy and liberty. Okay, our hot button words this semester, right? Okay, so whenever he delivered the Gettysburg Address, identified the nation's mission with the principle that all men are created equal. Okay, again, a theme for us this semester. What is democracy? What is liberty? Who is entitled to those things? Okay, so all men are created equal. We're all entitled to liberty, the pursuit of our happiness, right? Okay, so all right, the war forged a new national self-consciousness reflected in the increasing use of the word nation, a unified political entity in place of the older union of separate states. Okay, so nation becomes our rhetoric. Um, the War in American Revolution. Jeez. Okay, I was about to say revolution. Okay, the War in American Religion. There we go. I think I'm actually gonna skip this slide. Yeah. Sorry, I'm just sitting here in silence, but I'm just reading through this. I think that we can. I'm just gonna move. Okay, that's it. The North's transformation. All right. A rising class of capitalist entrepreneurs gained power because of the war. Think about um, going back to what I said at the very beginning of this chapter in part one, you know, our market system, the industrialized North, everything that's going on there, um, the railroad system. Okay, so all of those industries that thrive during a wartime economy create this class of capitalist entrepreneurs, which we won't really get into this because we're about to end for the semester, but this takes us into the Gilded Age and the era of the Carnegies and the Rockefellers, okay? Stuff like that. And so this is kind of the early stages of that. Okay, so the North experienced the war as a time of prosperity. Like I said, all of those markets were able to thrive. The industry benefited from inflation, government contracts, so wartime economy, right? So New England mills supplied blankets and uniforms for the Army. Pennsylvania coal mines and ironworks thrived in lots of different ways. Okay, lots of things could be produced utilizing coal and iron. All right. The mechanization of boot and shoe production, as well as the meat packing. Um, so food is now being tinned, right? So you can preserve things, keep them longer. Um, the image of Uncle Sam actually comes from a meat packer who used to, well, I guess that goes back to Revolutionary era, but meat packers and helping the army. So this is important, all right? All right, government and the economy. All right, so government or Congress passed land grants for railroads, like I said, and industries. Huge during this time and will continue to be super important in the United States for the upcoming decades. Okay, so 100 million acres were given to the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific companies, okay, chartered in 1862 to build a railroad from the Missouri River to the Pacific coast, okay? So this takes me to our next point. This will be completed in 1869. This is known as the Transcontinental Railroad. The Golden Spike, which connected the two um, construction projects. Um, did I make a note of exactly where? In Utah, I do believe. So I think near Salt Lake City. Okay, so this, with the completion of this, it ran from Omaha to San Francisco. It reduced cross-country travel times from 4 to 6 months to less than a week. Okay, so that's huge. With that, that's then expanded the national market. Okay, all of these things can be traded pretty quickly. Okay, facilitated settlement. All right, people can travel quickly, less than a week to get, across half the nation. So people start moving, investing. Okay, and then that is what will really usher in the destruction of the Plains Indians or Plains communities. And for us in Oklahoma, again, we won't really get to this because our semester and topic is about to end, but whenever we get to the 1880s, there is a lot of westward migration, people moving west, and this will bring in devastation for our Plains communities. Okay. So Oklahoma history is very entangled in that. Okay, but so with the railroad system, it took 20,000 laborers to build. Okay. Largely built by Chinese immigrant workers, okay, hundreds of whom died because of, uh, disease, but also accidents on the job, especially whenever they would have to, they were trying to get through mountainous areas, and they would use dynamite to try to clear these spaces. It was just a very dangerous field to be in. Okay. All right. So the West and the war. Last time we talked about, a lot of warfare going on closer to Washington, D.C., so Maryland and Virginia, right? So let's look west a little bit. Um, I said that this went into, for us, Indian Territory. So Missouri, Kansas, Indian Territory, Arkansas, Tennessee, we talked about last time. Um, the Southwest borderlands, right? Okay, so October 1861, Confederate units from Texas launched an invasion in New Mexico. There was the Confederate defeat at Floret Pass in March of 1862. Okay, so by the Union, this ended Confederate plans to take Western Territory for the Southern version of Manifest Destiny, therefore expanding slavery into that area. Okay. So the withdrawal of troops from the West increased conflict between Indigenous Americans and Caucasian settlers. Okay. The Sioux community was attacked in Minnesota. And then we also have massacres, so, okay, Minnesota, the Dakotas, Colorado, there's a lot of violence going on between settlers and First Americans, okay? Okay, so the Union campaign against the Navajo led to the tribe's Long Walk, which was the equivalent, of the Trail of Tears, right? Okay, so this was the forced relocation of 8,000 Navajo people, okay, where they were eventually allowed to return to a portion of their lands. Okay, so the Cherokee sided with the Confederacy, which after the war, okay, so yeah, after 1865, they were then forced to cede much of their land. They were treated as Confederates, okay? They also had to accept former slaves into the Cherokee Nation and give them land, although they were the only slave owners who were required to do so. Caucasian Americans were not expected to do this. All right, so women and the war. Okay, so women, stepped into the workforce as nurses, factory workers, and government clerks. This is not a surprise. You know, war affects women too. So any war you can find women serving in positions. So we talked about this during the American Revolution. So this, 100 years later, this is how women were helping in the war effort. Okay, so hundreds of thousands of Northern women took part in humanitarian organizations, sanitary fairs where they would collect goods that would then be sent to soldiers. All right, this was organized by groups like the Sanitary Commission, the USSC. Yeah, so groups like this will lead to later humanitarian organizations, okay? But so Northern women were brought into the public sphere, which is something I've talked about. Our spherical system of gendered work, okay? So this brings women into the public sphere, which is often considered masculine, okay? And war work offered them a taste of independence, which again, not really our era, but think about World War II and how many women, the Rosie the Riveter image, okay? This offered women, this way to leave the home, go work, see what this public sphere was like, and it gave them this taste of independence, okay? A well-known name to come out of this era is Clara Barton, okay? She organized supply lines. She served as a nurse, and then after the war, she became president of the Red Cross. All right, so Clara Barton, yeah, okay, anyway, sorry. Alrighty. Okay, so let's look at what's going on in the Confederate side just a little bit. All right, so Jefferson Davis is our leader, or their leader, I should say, at this point. He proved unable to communicate the war's meaning effectively to, average citizens. Okay. So, and by saying that, it can assume that I mean Caucasian Americans, all right? But so to, but anyway, so, okay. All right, under Davis, the Confederate nation became far more centralized than the Old South had been. The Confederate government gained control over railroads. They also built factories. Okay, so they started seeing how the Northern model had helped the Union Army, so they tried to kind of do that for themselves as well. Okay, so social change and internal turmoil or problems with the Confederacy throughout the war. Okay, and the draft encouraged class divisions amongst Caucasian Americans. Wealthy slave owners received draft exemptions for having 20 or more slaves. Many southern Yemen, so our poor farmers, right, started to see the conflict as a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. You may have heard that in regards to other wars, but so that is a pretty popular sentiment, okay? So a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. Okay. Okay, so economic problems that were going on in the South because, like we've talked about a few times over, their economy very was not diversified like the North, okay? So they were in crisis throughout the war. There were shortages of different things like salt, corn, meat. There were food riots because of this. Countless farms, plantations, businesses, railroads, all of these things were left in ruin. All right, they issued their own money, so Confederate money. You may have heard jokes, that's as worthless as Confederate money because it ultimately meant nothing, right? Okay, but so they printed their own money. Okay, so numerous Yemen families, pardon me, many of whom had gone to war to preserve their economic independence, sank into poverty and debt. Again, food riots. So if you're interested or if you need this for your research, even though we're mostly done at this point, I think, but the book White Trash by Nancy Eisenberg is a history of the Yemen class. So the Yemen class during the Civil War is something that she gets into as well. Okay, so by the war's end, over 100,000 Southern men had deserted. Okay, all right. So women in the Confederacy, we talked about women a couple minutes ago. That was largely Northern women. Okay, so women in the Confederacy, um, different picture. Okay, to a certain extent, they still, volunteered as nurses for Confederate troops. They, do I talk about cemeteries? Maybe not. Trying to mention that in just a second. So, all right, even more than in the North, the war placed unprecedented burdens on Southern Caucasian women, many of whom stayed on their farms and plantations. Okay, and yeah, so like I said, they served as nurses, clerks. They worked in factories as those started to be developed. Okay, the war led to the first political mobilization of non-slaveholding Caucasian women. The absence of husbands from their previously self-sufficient farms made it impossible to survive. Um, States distributed supplies to individuals in circumstances like this. Okay, and the growing disaffection of Southern Caucasian women contributed to the decline in home front morale and encouraged desertion from the army. Okay, so how women were viewing the war directly inspired, the men in their lives also. But I think it's called Widows of the South. But after battles, you know, armies moved on and left bodies on the battlefields. And well, so on the northern side, Union troops would bury their dead. Grave diggers were often men of color. Okay. And in the South, Confederate soldiers were often left. Okay. So Southern women are largely responsible for the cemeteries of the South. and there were times that they moved remains that they were at the skeletal point when they were found, but they still, would move them and place them in Confederate cemetery. But so that was some of the organization that was going on from Southern women. Okay. Okay. So African American soldiers for the Confederacy. We talked about, the Union side of things and like the 54th Massachusetts Company. Okay. So let's look at the Southern side. All right. So a shortage of manpower led to the Confederate Congress in March of 1865 to authorize the arming of slaves. This was heavily resisted because many Caucasian American Southerners feared that there would then be rebellions against them, right? Anyway, I was going to make a comment about if you don't want people to rebel against you, then maybe you should have acted better. But anyway, that is tough to say because that was such an ingrained system for so long. But it made sense that they would expect rebellions against the way they treated other humans for generations. But anyway, so that was resisted. Okay. The war ended before substantial recruitment of African Americans as Confederate soldiers um, took hold, mostly because when enslaved African Americans left, they didn't stick around, they went north, right? So this never panned out, all right? Okay, but so the South's decision to use African American troops undermined their pro-slavery ideology. Again, this goes back to this resistance because they didn't know, but everyone's short-circuited is what it comes down to, okay? All right. And so turning points in the war. Gettysburg, all right? So General Lee from the Confederate side advanced into northern soil in Pennsylvania, but was held back by Union troops under George Meade. So this is the Battle of Gettysburg. This went on from July 1st to July 3rd of 1863 and remains the largest battle ever fought on the North American continent. Okay, so Lee's army ended up retreating to Virginia, never again to set foot on northern soil. Okay, so General Grant, Ulysses S. Grant on the Union side, secured a northern victory at Vicksburg, Mississippi. Okay, so the last day of Gettysburg, this is also going on, so July 3rd. Okay, so Grant had launched a siege on the city. Confederate troops surrendered, and the Mississippi River Valley then lay in Union hands. All right. Okay, so 1864. Under U.S. Grant, the campaign of a war of attrition was launched. Okay, so what this equates to was a willingness to accept high numbers of casualties, knowing the North could replace losses as the South could not. All right. So at the end of 6 weeks of fighting, beginning in May, in Virginia, Grant's casualties stood at 60,000, which was almost the size of Lee's entire army. Lee lost about half of that, so 30,000 people. There's daily combat, trench warfare, which we talked about last time. Yeah, the main model of warfare being implemented. Okay, so in the fall, Grant began a siege at Petersburg in Virginia, which controlled the railroad, what do you know, to Richmond. Okay. All right, so General Sherman entered Atlanta in September 1864, seizing Georgia's main railroad center. That same year, Lincoln is reelected. Okay. So rehearsals for Reconstruction and the end of the war. which Reconstruction is the period immediately following the Civil War. Okay, so like I said, there's a turning point, and kind of from this point on, Union forces, yeah, are getting ready to um, bring in these practices after the war ends. Okay, so as the war drew to a close, federal authorities found themselves presiding over the transition from slavery to freedom. This was kind of first done with what will become known as the South Islands experiment. So this is off the coast of South Carolina. So the Union occupied these islands there back in November of 1861, so kind of early on in the war. Caucasian Americans in that area then fled, and that left 10,000 slaves in this region. Okay, so Union reformers, teachers, officers, and um, investors, they then move into the islands. Okay, so like I said, educators are part of this. So women begin teaching freed slaves. So Charlotte Fortin and Laura Town are a couple of examples of these women. But so, yeah, the South Islands experiment really was the Union's way of figuring out how um, Reconstruction would eventually play out a little bit. Okay. Okay. So wartime Reconstruction in the West. All right. So after Vicksburg in July of 1864, the Union established regulations for plantation labor, in which freed people signed labor contracts with plantation owners who swore an oath of loyalty, and they were paid wages. Okay. They also received an education. Physical punishment was prohibited, and their families were safe from the threat of sale. Okay. So neither side was apparently satisfied with the new labor system. African Americans resented having to resume work for Caucasian Americans and being forced to sign labor contracts. This will be a talking point in Reconstruction because when the war ends, many former slaves, exactly what I just said, stay and work for their former owners. Okay. This is problematic in a lot of ways. Okay. So that's more of a chapter 15 discussion. But these emotions begin, they're seen early on, is what I'm saying. Okay. Okay. And so in Davis Bend in Mississippi, emancipated slaves divided the land for themselves, which is kind of a rare instance of that happening. Okay. Okay. So victory at last. Um, if you watch Glory, if you've seen Glory, this part of the war is what is depicted. Okay. Um, the Islands experiment in the Carolinas, this is all part of this push from Union troops into that region. So Glory's awesome for depicting that. Um, okay. All right. Sherman and Union forces marched from Atlanta to the sea. So the march to the sea is what is kind of shown in that movie. Um, it doesn't describe it in a lot of so much in title, but if you know that this is what you're looking at, it's good. It's a good thing. Okay. So Sherman and Union forces marched from Atlanta to the sea. Sorry, march to the sea. This happens in November and December 1864. They had 60,000 troops. They headed into South Carolina, okay, to cut off communication. Okay. It's brought about even greater destruction, destroyed railroads. Okay, like I said, that communication was largely centered around the railroad, destroyed buildings as well, food and supplies. Okay, the 13th Amendment was approved on January 31st, 1865, which abolished slavery. Okay, on April 2nd, Grant then broke through Lee's lines at Petersburg, forcing the Army of Northern Virginia to abandon the city, and it left Richmond defenseless. Which, remember, Richmond was the goal the whole time. Okay. So the next day, Grant took Richmond. Lee then surrendered at the Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th, 1865, effectively ending the Civil War. Okay. So that's April 9th. Okay. So 5 days later, so this is less than a week, when emotions are still boiling from a lot of people, President Lincoln is shot. Okay, so April 14th. So Lincoln is shot at the Ford Theater, Washington, D.C., and he's carried out from the building, taken across the street, and dies the next morning at like 4 or 5 a.m., I think. Um, so a short-lived victory in a sense for a lot of people, okay, from our Union supporters, right? Okay, so the war in American history. So this goes back to memory, the way things are remembered, okay? So the Civil War laid the foundation for modern America, preserving the Union, destroying slavery, and shifting power from Southern planters to Northern capitalists. So our industrialized Northern system becomes the way, okay? All right, so the work of achieving equality for African Americans remained to be done, which again, this gets into Reconstruction in chapter 15, okay? So both sides lost something they had gone to war to defend. Confederacy lost slavery, and the war hastened the transformation of Lincoln's America, um, of free labor, small shops, and independent farmers into an industrial giant. Which, like I said, the people who gain power because of the industries that thrive during this wartime economy become our industrial giants of the Gilded Age, which is really the 1870s through like 1900. Okay. All right. So a lot of wealth uh, is developed for a very few uh, people in the United States. Okay. So for chapter 15, because this class ends with chapter 15, and then whenever I do my modern history class, it actually starts with chapter 15. So I have recorded chapter 15's lecture already. I did it back in August. So I would like for you guys to watch it so you know how this ends and where this leaves off going into the modern era, truly. So you'll have to scroll down to the beginning of my list of videos, but it's chapter 15, part 1, part 2. So please watch that, go through your notes, all that stuff. But yeah, this is where the war ends. And effectively, this was our main talking point for this semester, you know? So much has been about the economies that were established, you know, North and South, and how that came to this head that brought us into the Civil War that completely shifts the United States, you know, bringing in modern America, like I said. But yeah, how strange. This is kind of it, I guess. Not for you guys, because you still please go through 15. So I will quit. I'll shut up and quit making it sound like this is the end. Anyway, please read, look at chapter 15 stuff, and then that will be the end, I guess. Okay. All right, if there's anything important, I will post it as far as deadlines and all that jazz. Make sure you know your deadlines and stuff to turn in. It's going to be coming up. Okay, if you guys have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I will talk to you later. Okay, bye.